Okay, welcome everybody. So this is my video recording where I'm going to briefly summarize some of the things that I would have talked about in class today. Your reading for this Monday was from the Marshall book, the chapter on the Middle East, and then from Hunt, his discussion of the remaking of the Middle East and North Africa. And if you look at some of the important things that you want to cover with that, the main idea here is decolonization and how decolonization is influencing the formation of new countries, new nation states across North Africa and the Middle East. And one of the seminal problems that they're facing is what they're going to do with these inherited borders that Europeans have given them. A lot of these states are carved out of areas that were once dominated by Islamic empires like the Ottomans or the Persian before them. And these were groups that loosely ruled over very diverse populations. Populations with diversity in religious beliefs. The Marshall book mentions we have Sunni and Shiites here, and then within Shiite you have all these different groups like the Alawites in Syria that some don't even consider to be Islamic, at least according to the Sunni Arabs. Right? You have differences in ethnicity and language, Arabs and Turks, these types of things. And then we have these outsiders, the Europeans, who then kind of position all these groups into these new states, these new spheres of influence that they dominate after the First World War until the Second World War. And then after the Second World War, these outsiders are pushed back out, and the groups living in these areas try and carve out a country of their own. But as that happens, it ends up resulting in competition between the groups, between states like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia and Jordan, right? And then also conflict within groups, as we get a lot of different minority populations in states like Lebanon that had worked with the outsiders, these Christian Maronites, who had worked with the French to help rule over the country as a colony, now are left in dominant position in the government, but are really a minority group, okay? So we have all kinds of issues being drawn up here. So for the Marshall book, I'd like you to, before next time, to try and write down identifications, short and simple answers for 2 to 3 sentences, working on these terms, and really just focus on the pages 144 to 156. And the key terms that I want you to focus on are the Arabian Desert, the Sykes-Picot line, the design of Iraq's borders, the tensions between the Saud and the Hashemite families and their kingdoms, Lebanon, and again here it's the design of their borders, and then the failure of pan-Arab nationalism, which is something that's so important to understanding what's happening. Marshall refers to this as one of the prime factors that drives the region in new political directions after the 1970s to the present day, and makes them turn towards Islam. And pan-Arab nationalism had a number of goals. The first was liberation and independence. First from the Ottomans, and that's why many different groups during the First World War worked with Great Britain and France, as they had a common enemy. They both wanted to defeat the Ottoman Empire, and in turn, the British and French promised that they would support their independence. Those promises for independence go largely unfulfilled until the Second World War, when those empires are weakened and have to relinquish control to movements and revolutions inside the region. A second goal of pan-Arab nationalism then is to cooperate and help each other achieve independence and build up strong states with strong militaries that then can reject Western influence. And you'll see the leading state in this struggle is Egypt and under Gamal Abdul Nasser, who, like Nehru of India that we talked about last week, is a part of the non-alignment movement. But non-alignment for him means something different. Whereas India, it was peace and mediation and elevating India through its moral authority. Nasser believes in the development of a strong military and regional cooperation that will prevent the West from intervening in regional affairs and help save domestic cultures from outsiders and their influence. Okay? And part of that means fighting against what they see to be as the last gasp of European colonialism, and that is the Jewish settlement of Israel and the foundation of a country, Israel, which happens in 1948 and sparks a massive, the first of several Arab-Israeli wars, where Arab states try to wipe Israel off the map. And this brings them into conflict with the Palestinians as well, because many of them have competing claims to territories or regions in the Middle East that run counter to the Palestinians, who also desire the creation of their own state. And we'll talk more about the the Palestinian-Israeli conflict later this semester. But basically what you should know is also after the First World War, Great Britain promises this movement of Jews in the United States and Europe that are promoting Zionism, the return and foundation of a holy land and country for the Jewish people in Israel. Great Britain promises its support for that secretly and begins to allow the migration of Jews out of Europe into what is today Israel, but was then a mandate called Palestine, an area given over to Great Britain to protect after the First World War. And simultaneous to this wave of migration of European and American Jews coming into that area in the 1920s and 1930s, you also have Great Britain promise Palestine for their help and support and for submitting to British authority, that they will have this exact same territory given to them as the land for their own nation state, their own independent state. And that's part of the conflict going on here. Okay, so the first slide just kind of shows you what we're talking about when we talk about decolonization in the Arab world. We're talking about this vast area of territory that covers the Arabian Desert, spreads along the southern shores of the Mediterranean, and it's an area where nationalism really picks up at the end of the 19th century, but it's first positioned in opposition to the Ottomans. So people like, the Egyptians saying, we're not Turks, we are Arabs, but we're not Turks, right? So we would like to be independent, and you see them get help in that matter. Now, Egypt's independence with help from the outside world is complicated through the creation of the Suez Canal. This is a major technological achievement that the Egyptians undertake. But in order to undertake this canal, which will link up the Mediterranean with the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, greatly reducing the time needed for trade and transport to Asia. They depend on outside foreign loans and expertise. And because of this, they see their own country eventually bankrupted. The monarchy of Egypt is bankrupted, and they're forced to sell off assets to pay off their debts to outsiders. Protecting those investments then becomes critical to the British Empire, who needs this channel to reach up to its other parts of its empire, the Indian Empire. But as I mentioned, a lot of Arab nationalism starts in first in opposition to the Ottoman rule. The First World War, this slide just kind of shows you. These are where the Ottoman lands used to be. So you can see they don't run as deep into North Africa as we're going to talk about with Algeria and Libya. But it does help the French, who were able to carve out portions of their empire and take it from the Ottomans in the 19th century. So the French arrived into North Africa as a colonial power in the late 19th century and began by occupying coastal areas and then moving further and further into the African interior. Colonization in countries like today's Algeria is a very slow, laborious, and very violent process by which French armies go by conquering village to village much of the Algerian countryside. But what makes this a different story is that Algeria, unlike other areas of the French Empire in Africa, is not seen as something that's a colony. It's a foreign place that's providing resources. It's actually becoming more of a settlement, and the French begin to envision this as not a colony but a province. So by 1900, we already have 1 million European settlers, the majority of which are French, but others drawn from all over Europe to settle in Algeria. And this is creating more and more conflict between native Algerians, who are largely Berber or Arab populations and Islamic, versus these French and Roman Catholic groups. And the idea that they should assimilate and become French citizens is bandied about by different French intellectuals and politicians in the 20th century. Most notably Leon Blum, who's a major leader in what's known as the the United Front, this movement of socialist and leftist parties in France in the 1930s. He proposes the idea that Algerians could become citizens of France if, like, modest levels of citizens. He's going to offer it first to veterans Algerian veterans who fought for France in the First World War or worked for their armies, school teachers, and then other groups that worked for the colonial government. What you should know there is that basically that alienates both the European settlers who don't want to see this happen, because if these people become citizens, then their hold on political power in the province and the province's resources and their privileged position in front of the law kind of evaporates. Okay? They become a less dominant group. And it's also rejected by a bunch of different Arab nationalists who, within their own schools, try and build up and stabilize their identity and reject the idea that they should assimilate and convert to being French, convert to speaking French, and convert to being Roman Catholics. And these schools, a common thing said among Algerian school children is, Islam is my religion, Arabic is my language, and Algeria is my country. And, a stiff resistance to this idea that they should abandon those things and think of themselves as French. Where conflict really erupts after 1945, though, is like we've seen with other places like Vietnam. There's this celebration that the war is ended, and this also anticipation by Algerians that now is the moment for their own liberation and their own independence from French rule, just as the French are excited to be freed of German rule, right? 1943 and 1944 and 1945. These celebrations lead to massive showdowns between Algerian nationalists parading and demonstrating in the streets, the French police, and then also the European settlers. And actually, Great Britain will help bring a bunch of French troops back into Algeria to help try and quell this rebellion. In the 1950s, it turns even more violent as an organization known as the FLN that you read about in Hunt, the Front de Libération Nationale, becomes the leading opposition to French rule. And its bases are all over the place. Some are within the country working as guerrilla warriors and targeting police and European settlers through raids, kidnapping, and other tactics of terror. And others are outside the country, forming armies in neighboring states like Tunisia or Morocco. But the most important one is in Cairo, under the support of Egypt. And this is part of Egypt's idea of pan-Arab nationalism, is that they will help Algeria as an Arab state also become independent and demonstrate its support for North Africans and rejecting European influence. What's important with the FLN is their use of bombings and raids and targeting civilians to try and scare or intimidate the French into leaving begins a wave of violence, a cycle of violence, where more and more French military are brought into the country, as many as 400,000 at one point, who then adopt the same tactics as the means to try and root out the FLN. Basically, they also use tactics of terror, kidnapping, arbitrary arrests, imprisonments, and very violent methods that are basically just reprisals against Algerians. And they use this to try and catch the FLN and exterminate its leaders. And so for Hunt, I want you to look at what drove the French resistance to Algerian independence, page 289 to 291. And what I want you to get there is to understand how what's happening in other aspects or other parts of the French Empire is influencing the French attitude towards Algeria. Their defeat, Hunt is going to say, at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam is going to humiliate the French military, who are already stinging for their poor performance in the Second World War and being occupied and defeated by Nazi Germany. And so they look at this as a last chance to prove themselves, right? As a chance to prove their effectiveness as a fighting force, but also their national pride, not wanting to relinquish another colony, not looking to be defeated by another third world nation. So humiliation is a factor. The last factor, and I won't take up too much time going on with that, but neighboring states like Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya gain gradual independence by working with the French. And their leaders are very, very conservative, like Mohammed V. And in part, they're able to gain their independence by showing that they won't do what's going on in Algeria and won't drag France into costly wars there. And that makes the French very supportive of these independence movements.